The first sign was the perfume. Not hers. Laura's scent was soft, floral, understated. This one was bold, musky, the kind of fragrance that lingered long after its wearer had left. It hit me as soon as I walked into the house that Tuesday evening. At first, I thought maybe one of her friends had come over, but when I called out her name, there was no answer. Just the silence of an empty home, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I wandered into the kitchen. The table was set for two, a half-empty bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and a used plate. My plate, actually. The one Laura hated because it had a chip on the rim. It was always the first thing she replaced when we had company. I frowned. The kids were at my sister's for the week, and I'd told Laura I'd be late finishing a project. So who had been here? And why had she used that plate? As I stood there, piecing things together, a sound caught my ear, the unmistakable click of a heel on tile. I turned, my pulse quickening. Laura stood in the doorway, still wearing the navy dress I'd complimented that morning, her hair slightly mussed. Back early, she said, her voice even, but there was something else there. Surprise. Maybe even panic. Who was here? I asked, gesturing toward the table. I tried to keep my tone casual, but the tension in my chest betrayed me. She glanced at the table, then back at me. Oh, just Ellen, she said quickly. She dropped by for a chat. Ellen? At 10 p.m.? I raised an eyebrow. Ellen was her book club friend, and as far as I knew, they usually met for coffee, not late-night wine dates. Laura smiled tightly and shrugged. She was upset about something. I didn't think you'd mind. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked to the table, picked up one of the glasses, and held it to my nose. It wasn't wine that lingered, it was lipstick. The crimson smudge on the rim was undeniable. Ellen didn't wear lipstick. Not like this. And that musky perfume? It wasn't hers either. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel the pieces starting to shift. My gut twisted, my hands clenched, and I knew this was only the beginning. After that night, the small inconsistencies started to stack up, each one louder than the last. It was the kind of evidence you couldn't explain away. I didn't jump to conclusions, I'm not wired like that. I needed something solid, something that didn't leave room for doubt. So, I waited and watched. A week later, I got my chance. Laura told me she'd be late home because of a work meeting, but her tone was too casual, almost rehearsed. The little details she usually gave me where, who, why weren't there. She just smiled over her shoulder and said, "Don't wait up." That set off alarm bells. She was polished but not perfect, and this? This was a slip. I called her office around 7:30, just to see if she was still there. A friendly-sounding receptionist informed me, with zero hesitation, that the meeting had ended at 6 o'clock. "Can I take a message for Laura?" "She left about an hour ago," she chirped. I hung up, my hand gripping the phone tighter than I intended. This was it. Something was definitely going on. But where do you even start with something like this? You don't accuse your wife of cheating without proof. So, I decided to get answers myself. That night, I told Laura I had an early start the next morning and turned in before she got home. I heard her coming around 11:30, her footsteps soft but uneven, as if she was trying to be quiet but wasn't steady on her feet. Maybe drunk. Maybe something else. She didn't come into the bedroom. Instead, I heard the soft sound of her heels clicking down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. Odd. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. I decided to look around, and it didn't take long to find the first crack. Her dress from the night before was draped over the chair in our walk-in closet, the hem dirty like she'd been walking through mud. That wasn't what caught my attention, though. It was the faint smear of foundation on the neckline. Laura didn't wear makeup often, she always said it was too much hassle unless it was a special occasion. So why the effort for a work meeting? Then there was the jacket. It was draped neatly over the back of the couch in the living room, but something about it didn't sit right. When I picked it up, I noticed the faintest trace of that same bold, musky perfume I'd smelled the week before. My stomach tightened. I went through her purse next, not proud of it but not stopping either. Inside, I found a receipt from a fancy restaurant downtown, The Willow. 2 people. Steak, salmon, and a $120 bottle of wine. This wasn't a work meeting. It wasn't even a casual dinner with friends. It was something else. Still, I needed more. So I decided to follow her. The next night, she told me she had to work late again. Same excuse, same polished delivery. But this time, I was ready. She left around 6 o'clock, and 10 minutes later, I was in my car, keeping a careful distance as I tailed her. She didn't go to her office. Instead, she drove to a dimly lit bar on the other side of town. I parked a block away and waited. She got out of the car, her hair down and freshly styled, wearing a sleek black dress I didn't even recognize. She walked into the bar without hesitation, and not 30 seconds later, a man followed her in. I didn't recognize him at first, but then it hit me. It was Brandon, her coworker, the one she'd casually mentioned a few times in the past year. Brandon's funny, she'd said once. Or, Brandon's such a great team player. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now? Now it felt like a clue I should have seen coming. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know for sure. So I waited a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing, and then walked into the bar. It wasn't crowded, which made it easy to spot them. They were tucked into a booth near the back, leaning in close. Laura was laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I sat at the bar, ordered a drink I didn't touch, and watched. They stayed there for over an hour, talking, laughing, occasionally touching in ways that were just a little too familiar. When they finally left, they didn't go their separate ways. Brandon's hand rested lightly on the small of her back as they walked to his car, and she didn't move away. I followed them again, keeping my distance. They drove to a boutique hotel just off the freeway, the kind with low lighting and discreet parking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack a rib, but I stayed in the car, parked far enough away to avoid being seen. They went inside, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the hotel's glowing sign, my mind racing. Anger and disbelief swirled together, but underneath it all was something colder, clarity. I knew now. There was no coming back from this. When I finally drove home, the house felt like a stranger's. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, every scrap of our shared life suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I sat down on the couch and stared into the dark, my hands gripping my knees as if that would stop them from shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't eat. I just sat there, replaying everything in my mind, trying to figure out when it had started and why I hadn't seen it sooner. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't just angry. I was ready. Ready to confront her, to make her face what she'd done. This wasn't just about cheating. This was about the life we'd built together, the trust she'd shattered, and the man she'd turned me into. A man who had to spy on his wife just to uncover the truth. I don't know what kept me calm the next morning. Maybe it was the hours I spent stewing in the living room with the fact that, deep down, I already knew what I had to do. Either way, when Laura came downstairs looking refreshed and cheerful, like she hadn't spent the night in another man's bed, I felt nothing but cold resolve. She kissed me on the cheek, an act that felt so absurd I nearly laughed. "Morning," she chirped, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You get home late last night?" I asked, watching her carefully. She froze for half a second, a hesitation so brief most people wouldn't catch it. But I wasn't most people anymore. "Yeah," she said casually. "Work's been a killer this week. You know how it is." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." I let it drop, for now. She went about her morning routine as if nothing had changed, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She seemed lighter somehow, almost carefree. That stung more than I expected. How could she look like this after what she'd done? By the time she left for work, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't waiting another day. This needed to happen now. I spent the next few hours preparing, not just what I was going to say but how I was going to say it. I printed out the hotel's receipt from her credit card account, the bar receipt from her purse, and a few candid photos I'd snapped on my phone the night before. I didn't want her to have room for excuses or denials. When she got home that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. "Hey," she said, smiling as she set her bag down. "What's for dinner?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Her smile faltered. "Okay. What's going on?" I gestured to the table, where I'd laid everything out. The receipts, the photos, the undeniable proof. She walked over slowly, her face unreadable as she took it all in. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "You tell me," I said, leaning against the counter with my arms crossed. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around, sleeping with Brandon. How long has it been going on?" Her head snapped up at that, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" she said, her tone defensive. "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I followed you last night, Laura. I saw you with him at the bar. I saw you go to the hotel. I know." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a few seconds, she just stood there, her face pale, her breathing quick. Finally, she sat down, burying her face in her hands. "It's not what you think," she mumbled. "Don't give me that," I snapped. "I've seen enough to know exactly what it is." "How long has it been going on?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not even a little. 6 months, she said quietly. I felt my stomach churn, but I didn't let it show. 6 months, I repeated. While I was here, taking care of the house, the kids, our life, you were off with him. Why? It's not like that, she said, shaking her head. Then what is it like, Laura? Enlighten me. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I don't know, she said finally. It just happened. That's bullshit, I said, my voice rising. 6 months doesn't just happen. You made a choice, over and over again. So don't sit there and pretend you don't know why. She flinched at my tone but didn't argue. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she said. Oh, well, that makes it better, I said, laughing bitterly. You didn't mean for it to happen. That fixes everything. She frowned. I'm trying to explain. No, you're trying to justify, I cut in. There's a difference. She stood up then, pacing the kitchen. I wasn't happy, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I felt stuck. Like I was suffocating. Brandon was just, he was there. So this is my fault? I asked, my voice cold. I didn't say that, she said quickly. You didn't have to, I shot back. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. I didn't want to hurt you. I stared at her, incredulous. You didn't want to hurt me? Are you serious right now? You've been lying to me for half a year, sneaking around behind my back, destroying everything we built together, and you didn't want to hurt me? Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. I was too angry, too disgusted to care. What do you want me to say? She asked. I want the truth, I said. Not excuses, not justifications. Just the truth. She looked away, biting her lip. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know why I did it. I just did. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. Unbelievable. For the next hour, we went back and forth. Every question I asked, she dodged or deflected. Every accusation I made, she tried to soften with half-hearted apologies and vague explanations. By the time I finally walked out of the room, I wasn't just angry, I was done. This wasn't a misunderstanding we could fix with therapy. It wasn't a mistake we could move past. It was a betrayal so deep, so complete, there was no coming back from it. I slept in the guest room that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Divorce was inevitable. The only question was how much I was willing to sacrifice to make it happen. One thing was certain, I couldn't stay in the same house as her, not after this. The life we'd built together was gone, shattered by her lies. All that was left now was to pick up the pieces and figure out what came next. I didn't wake up angry the next morning. The anger had burned off, leaving something colder, sharper in its place. It wasn't sadness, I didn't have the luxury of that yet. It was determination. I'd spent the night replaying the confrontation in my head, dissecting every word she'd said, every weak excuse she'd offered. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was what I was going to do next. Laura was already gone when I came downstairs. She'd left a note on the counter that simply said, "I'm staying at Ellen's tonight. I need time to think." I tossed it in the trash without a second glance. Time to think? She'd had 6 months to think while she snuck around with Brandon. Now it was my turn to make the next move, and I wasn't going to waste it. I started by gathering evidence. Real evidence. The kind that couldn't be twisted or downplayed. I already had the receipts, the photos, and the timeline from the night I followed her, but I needed more. Proof that left no room for doubt, not in a divorce court, and not in the court of public opinion. First, I called up a private investigator I'd found online. The guy came highly recommended and sounded as no nonsense as I needed him to be. "Get me everything," I told him. "Dates, places, pictures, texts, whatever it takes." He promised to start right away. Next, I dug into her digital life. Laura had always been meticulous about her privacy, but she wasn't perfect. Her email was still logged in on the desktop in the study, and it only took a few clicks to find what I was looking for. She'd been careless, there were messages from Brandon, poorly hidden under the name Ellen Work. Reading them made my stomach churn. The words weren't just flirtatious, they were intimate, detailed, raw. There was no mistaking what they'd been doing or how long it had been going on. I saved everything to a USB drive and backed it up on a cloud server. Then I called my lawyer. I didn't know him personally, but his reputation was brutal. The kind of attorney who turned divorce proceedings into bloodsport. He listened as I laid out the situation, then asked, "Do you want this to be clean, or do you want her to feel it?" "She needs to feel it," I said, my voice steady. Over the next few hours, we strategized. I told him about Brandon, about Laura's lies, and about the evidence I'd already collected. He gave me a list of documents to gather: bank statements, property records, anything that could prove what was mine and what was hers. By the end of the call, I had a clear plan. Step 1, freeze her out financially. Step 2, expose her affair to the people who mattered most. Step 3, ensure that when this was over, she'd be left with nothing but regrets. That afternoon, I went to the bank and opened a new account in my name only. Then I transferred every penny from our joint savings into it. Legally, it was a gray area, but my lawyer assured me it was a necessary move to protect myself. I left just enough in the joint account to cover basic bills, enough to avoid suspicion but not enough to let her live comfortably. I also canceled her access to my credit cards. Laura made good money, but she'd grown used to the little luxuries I provided: the extra vacations, the fancy dinners, the monthly spa visits. All of that was about to end. Next, I reached out to a friend of mine who worked in IT. "I need help pulling data from a phone," I told him. "Nothing illegal, just access to what's already there." He hesitated for a moment, but after I explained the situation, he agreed to help. By the end of the day, I had everything I needed: text logs, call records, even a few photos that Brandon had sent her. Most of it was disgusting, but it was also damning. The following day, I put the second part of my plan into motion. Laura's reputation had always been important to her. She prided herself on being seen as a pillar of the community. So I started with her inner circle. I sent anonymous emails to her closest friends, attaching copies of the texts and photos. I kept the message short: "Thought you should know who you're really dealing with." Then I moved on to Brandon. I sent the same package to his boss, along with a polite note explaining that I'd prefer to avoid legal action but would be happy to discuss his employees' behavior if necessary. Finally, I reached out to Laura's parents. This part stung a little. I'd always liked them, and they'd been nothing but kind to me. But they needed to know the truth. I called her mother first, keeping my tone measured but firm as I laid everything out. She was horrified. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice shaking. "Laura would never." "She did," I interrupted. "I wish it weren't true, but it is. I thought you should hear it from me before it comes out some other way." By the time I hung up, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Laura might have thought she could keep her affair hidden, but the walls were closing in. When Laura came home that evening, she looked exhausted. She barely said a word as she dropped her bag on the couch and went to pour herself a glass of wine. "We need to talk," I said, standing in the doorway. She froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "What now?" "You've been served," I said, holding up the envelope containing the divorce papers. Her face went pale. "This is how you want to do it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Like this?" "This is how you did it," I shot back. "I'm just finishing what you started." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and something else, fear. "You don't have to do this," she said. "We can fix it." "It's too late for that," I said, turning to leave. "You made your choice. Now live with it." As I walked out of the room, I felt the weight of the past few days lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was back in control. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Laura pacing outside the guest room door. Her movements were frantic, uneven, and I could hear her muffled voice as she spoke on the phone. I guess she was talking to her lawyer, or maybe Brandon. I didn't care. I'd been bracing for this conversation all night. Today was going to be the day everything came to a head. I got dressed slowly, taking my time as she moved back and forth like a caged animal. When I finally opened the door, she spun around to face me, her eyes bloodshot and wide with frustration. She wasn't the poised, confident woman I'd known for years, she was unraveling, piece by piece. "We need to talk," she said, her voice clipped and shaky. "Funny," I replied, brushing past her toward the kitchen. "That's what you said 6 months ago when this all started." "Oh wait, no, you didn't." I sat down at the table, sipping the coffee I'd made earlier. She followed me, slamming her hands on the table as she sat across from me. "Can we just stop this?" she snapped. "You've made your point. I get it. You're angry. But this isn't fair." I raised an eyebrow at her. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? What's fair about lying to me for 6 months while you ran around with Brandon?" Her face twisted with anger and embarrassment. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," I cut her off. "You don't get to play the victim here. Not after everything you've done." She leaned back, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm not playing the victim." "But we've been together for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Clearly it didn't mean much to you," I said. "If it did, we wouldn't be here right now." For a moment, she didn't say anything. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then she took a deep breath, her voice softening. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But don't throw everything away over one mistake." I laughed bitterly. "A mistake? That's what you call 6 months of sneaking around, lying to my face, and spending the night in hotels with another man? A mistake is spilling coffee on someone's shirt. What you did was a choice, a series of choices." Her lip quivered, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But then her expression hardened. "Fine. You're right. I made choices. But we can still fix this. We can go to counseling, talk to someone." "Stop," I said, holding up my hand. "This isn't something you can fix. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed the foundation of our marriage. You broke my trust, Laura. And trust isn't something you can glue back together with therapy and apologies. She shook her head, her voice rising. You're being unreasonable. People make mistakes all the time, and they move past them. Why can't we? Because I don't want to, I said firmly. I deserve better than this. Better than you. That hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in years, I saw her completely speechless. I've spent the last few days thinking about this, I continued, my tone even. About us. About everything we've built together. And I realized something. It's all been a lie. Don't say that, she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. But it's true, isn't it? I said. For 6 months, you've been lying to me every day. Every kiss, every smile, every I love you, it was all a lie. How am I supposed to move forward from that? How am I supposed to look at you and not see the person who stabbed me in the back? Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. You say you're sorry, but sorry doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't erase the nights you spent with him, the lies you told me, the humiliation you put me through. You made your choice, Laura. Now it's time to live with the consequences. She wiped her face with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she spoke. So that's it? 15 years, and you're just throwing it all away? I'm not the one who threw it away, I said coldly. You did that the moment you decided to betray me. She sat there for a long moment, her shoulders shaking as she cried into her hands. I wanted to feel something for her, sympathy, pity, even anger, but all I felt was emptiness. The Laura I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Finally, she looked up at me, her face red and swollen. What do you want me to do? She asked quietly. Tell me, and I'll do it. Anything. You can sign the divorce papers, I said bluntly. That's the only thing left for you to do. Her eyes widened in shock. Divorce? You can't be serious. I'm dead serious, I said. I already filed. The papers will be here tomorrow. You can sign them and move out, or you can fight me and lose everything. Either way, we're done. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but didn't know how. Finally, she stood up, her voice trembling with desperation. What about the kids? What are we supposed to tell them? The truth, I said. That their mother made choices that destroyed our family. You can't do that to them, she said, her voice breaking again. I'm not the one who did this, I said, standing up to face her. You are. You don't get to play the victim, and you don't get to decide how this ends. You lost that right the moment you walked into that hotel room with him. She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't happiness or relief, but it was something. The beginning of closure, maybe. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let her destroy me any more than she already had. The rest of my life was waiting, and I wasn't going to waste another second of it on her lies. Laura didn't come home that night. I didn't expect her to, and honestly, I was relieved. It gave me the space I needed to focus on the next steps. I had no interest in dragging this out any longer than necessary, and I wanted the divorce finalized as quickly and cleanly as possible. The damage was done, there was no use prolonging the inevitable. The first thing I did the next morning was schedule a meeting with my lawyer. We went over the evidence I'd gathered and discussed my options. I told him I wanted full custody of the kids and was willing to fight for it if Laura tried to push back. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I couldn't trust her judgment anymore, not after what she'd done. The lawyer assured me we had a strong case, especially with the proof of her affair. Adultery might not carry the same legal weight as it once did, but it would still work in my favor. As the week wore on, the fallout from Laura's actions began to spread. The emails I'd sent to her friends and family had made their rounds, and I started receiving calls and messages from people who were shocked, angry, or just curious. Most of them wanted to know if it was true. I didn't hold back. I told them exactly what she'd done, letting the evidence speak for itself. If Laura wanted to defend herself, that was her problem, not mine. Then there was Brandon. I heard through the grapevine that his boss had called him in for a meeting after receiving my email. Apparently, the company had a strict no fraternization policy, and his affair with Laura was a direct violation. He was fired by the end of the week. That brought me a small, grim sense of satisfaction. He'd destroyed my marriage, and now his career was in tatters too. Fair was fair. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be spiraling. She'd been staying at Ellen's house since our confrontation, but I could tell from her sporadic text messages that she was struggling to hold it together. She kept asking to meet, saying we needed to talk things through, but I refused. There was nothing left to say. Every time her name popped up on my phone, I felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. I'd spent 15 years building a life with her, only to watch it crumble in the span of a few weeks. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of dragging this out any longer. Eventually, she stopped texting altogether. I assumed she'd finally accepted the reality of the situation, or maybe she was too busy dealing with the fallout from her affair to bother me anymore. Either way, I didn't care. My focus was on moving forward. The kids were the hardest part of all of this. They'd been staying with my sister during the initial chaos, but I knew I couldn't shield them from the truth forever. When they finally came home, I sat them down and told them everything, well, almost everything. I kept the details of Laura's affair to a minimum, framing it as a mistake rather than a betrayal. I didn't want to burden them with the full weight of what their mother had done, at least not yet. They took the news better than I expected, though there were tears and plenty of questions. "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" my daughter asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "But that doesn't change how much we love you. You're the most important thing in the world to us, and that will never change." It felt hollow even as I said it. How could I reassure them when I didn't even believe it myself? Still, I did my best to answer their questions and remind them that none of this was their fault. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I moved Laura's things into storage and started redecorating the house, removing every trace of her presence. I went back to work, reconnected with old friends, and even joined a local gym to fill the hours I used to spend with her. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I couldn't let her betrayal define me. One evening, as I was sorting through some old photo albums, I came across a picture of Laura and me from our honeymoon. We were standing on a beach in Hawaii, both of us grinning like idiots as the sun set behind us. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the person she'd become. Eventually, I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. That chapter of my life was over, and it was time to move on. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Laura signed the papers without a fight, though she refused to meet me in person. My lawyer said she'd been quiet during the proceedings, almost resigned. I didn't ask for details. All I cared about was that it was done. I was granted primary custody of the kids, with Laura getting visitation rights every other weekend. She didn't contest it, which surprised me at first. But then I realized she probably knew it was a losing battle. Between the evidence of her affair and her increasingly erratic behavior, there was no way she could argue for more. The day the papers came through, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. There were no celebrations, no triumphant moments. Just a quiet acceptance that this was my new reality. Looking back, I can't say I've learned anything profound from this experience. People like to talk about personal growth and finding meaning in adversity, but for me, it was simpler than that. I learned that trust is fragile, that betrayal cuts deeper than I ever imagined, and that sometimes the only way forward is to let go of what's holding you back. Life hasn't returned to normal, not yet. But it's getting there. The kids are adjusting, I'm adjusting, and for the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe again. The scars are still there, but they're starting to fade. And maybe that's enough. As for Laura, I don't know what she's doing now, and I don't care. She made her choices, and I made mine. Our paths have diverged, and there's no looking back. This is my life now. It's not perfect, and it's not what I planned, but it's mine. And that's all that matters.